Morning, everyone. Welcome to VC Ag Today this Thursday morning, August 6, 2020. Hope everyone is doing well and fared well through the tropical storm earlier this week. Today, we're pleased to be joined by Dr. Bobby Grisso, a professor and engineer within the Systemic Biological Systems of Engineering School at Virginia Tech. So thank you, Bobby, for joining us this morning. We really appreciate you being here. And with that being said, just a few housekeeping notes for those of you that have not joined us before. We ask that you please keep your questions or comments to the end of the presentation, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion at the end. If you had the ability to use the chat window, if you just enter your questions there, we'll address those throughout the presentation and get you some answers at the end. So with that being said, we appreciate Dr. Grisso joining us this morning, and the floor is yours. Thank you, Dr. Grisso.
Thank you so much, Robbie. I appreciate the opportunity. And let me see if I can switch over to my slides. How am I doing? Can you see that?
Yes, sir. Perfect. Thank you.
Let me just say that from the beginning that it was an honor for me to serve as your associate director for 7 or 8 years. And I moved into an interim department head role, which I am so grateful that I was able to get a replacement by the 1st of January. I'm not sure I could have handled the stress of COVID. And so, matter of fact, I think about when I started in 1985. Yes, I know that some of y'all guys weren't even born then. In extension, that I would have never thought I would see a day like we have today. But let me commend the leadership group of this particular activity, a VCE Ag Update. I really appreciate what y'all guys have been doing. I've been following along and really have enjoyed it. Again, everybody calls me Bobby, and I'm in the Biological Systems Engineering Department, one of the 8 or 9 engineering departments on campus. I also teach the senior design component within our curriculum. This year, I'm looking forward to having about 77 students coming back on campus here in 2 or 3 weeks. And when Trent asked me to do this, I said, this is really the only date that I have open with that upcoming class. So our department is celebrating 100 years of activity. Of course, it started off being agricultural engineering. I have 2 degrees from the program as well. The other item that's celebrating 100 years that I was involved with was the Nebraska tractor test. And I had hoped to go out to Nebraska and celebrate with them. But just like our celebration, it's been canceled. And matter of fact, we're not even sure we can get ours off in October. I did have the opportunity when we went into phase 3 to be able to get back on the Blue Ridge Parkway and visit the Mabry's Mill, which is probably about 16 miles as a crow flies to my grandfather's home place. So Maggie and Molly and my wife really enjoyed that trip. Today, I'm going to talk about 3 different items. Of course, we want to talk about harvesting, but since it's going to be a little bit warm in August, I thought it would be helpful to talk to you about a new tool that's on health stress, or heat stress, excuse me. And then I'd like to follow up at the end with a couple slides talking about yield monitors, getting our combines prepared for the fall. Can you see my next slide, Robbie, just to check?
Yes, sir. We're on slide 2.
Okay, good. I've noticed that a couple times people have got somehow that they weren't able to advance their slides on this particular item. If you're, in matter of fact, this is a neat new tool. Matter of fact, it just came out in the middle of July. It's really being used by the military and athletics. But I can really see this being a useful tool for ag workers. Matter of fact, I talk a little bit about heat stress and how to watch for it, et cetera, in one of our publications on lawn care with crew management, lawn care crews. But this new item referred to as the wet bulb global temperature and incorporates several other things that heat index does not. And so I thought this might be a useful tool for you. And so it's located on a website called Convergence. This is a climate center And it's so far, this particular tool is only available for Virginia and North Carolina. And that's the reason I think we ought to take a look at it. So what I'm going to do is to go to that particular tool and see if I can get it to work. If not, I got a couple slides to kind of cover us. Can you see the tool, or at least the website?
Yes, sir. It's just loading now.
Okay, great. So this is the website, and so you have several different items on this page that will describe in more detail about the items. But what I want to show is basically you can find any location on the map. And so what I'm going to type in today is the Airfield 4-H Center. Type that in. It'll go directly there, and you can see it there in the screen. And you can go anywhere on that screen, and then it gives you an opportunity to be able to choose several different days. I'm going to choose the most recent because I know we're going to have a heat wave coming up here by the end of the week. Submit that. And what this shows is a heat index, if you will, or the WBGT item. And what you can see is that basically today, we're not going to get up into a high index, but by Sunday noon, you'll start to see that there's a fairly high index where it's going to be a good opportunity to have a lot of heat stress. And so this tool could be utilized for looking at plans for 4-H events all the way to field days and et cetera. And you can kind of watch where those go through. Of course, the athletic departments, primarily for football, while they're practicing, they're looking at several of these items as well as far as morning and afternoon practice. And so basically what I'm showing you here is that there's a way to be able to utilize that particular tool in order to look at very high indexes. The color coding is important. And if you look at that website at the bottom, they have this particular little item about the indexes. Of course, black area is supposed to spend all types of activity as far as working in that particular environment. And you can see the other ones that are here. Of course, I can't refuse to talk about, if you're working with a variety of people, or people are actually in a crew of some sort, it's nice to be able to know what the symptoms are and some of the things that might be going on with them. So always being alert and knowing the signs is useful. When Trent asked me to do this, I had to remember that basically, we really go about 20-some days, 21 days, I think it is, and we can be in a pretty severe drought. And what I've got here is two different maps from the climate centers. Oh, excuse me. One dating back to July, and one just recently on Friday. And we've moved into a moderate, almost into secondary D2 drought situations in some portions of our state. Now, this is probably going to change by the time that we incorporate the hurricane into the mix for this that we occurred this week. But at the same time, the damage has probably already been done. And so just on the 3rd of August, a couple days ago, the Ag Statistics reporting, which you agents really contribute to, show the corn in very poor condition, 50%, 15% very poor condition, 24% rated as poor. So almost 40% of our corn crop across the state is probably in pretty critical condition. And so the group asked me to take a look at, are there some tips that we can do about combine and getting ready for that would be useful for our farmers. I had the opportunity while working at University of Nebraska to work with several different groups of individuals, and one of those groups are custom combiners. And I learned a lot from these individuals, and so one of the things that I would ask you to do is that you got to kind of keep in mind some of the recommendations that I'm finding go right against what some people might think is the right way to make some adjustments. The reason I point that out is that a lot of times we don't have a lot of hours in a combine. So a lot of the custom crews that start in Texas and go up through the Dakotas may get even 500 to 750 hours in a combine over the course of that travel. And so the opportunity to be able to work with these individuals, and I would say the other source of information that you need to take a look at is your local dealers. As you start to look at this, it might be a good advice to go out and talk to your dealers about maybe hosting and letting them go through some tips about harvesting drought corn. Now, as I take a look at drought-related type corn, there are several things that you have to remember as far as looking at this, is that number one, the yields are very low. Number two, they're probably susceptible to a lot more stress from insects and diseases, so the stalk and et cetera is a lot weaker than what we would typically have. And so one of the issues is getting that corn cob actually into the combine for it to work. So I'm going to go through a couple different items. I'm going to show you several different insides of a combine and then talk about the adjustment. One of the first things that you learn about from the custom combiners is that basically what you always want to do is have the combine completely loaded. That goes all automatically against the grain of what we're talking about here as far as a situation where we have low yields, and so we're not getting as much material through the combine. Of course, when we're talking about corn, we don't want to bring the whole plant into the combine, but at the same time, some will come through. But what we're trying to do with the corn picker head is to pull that stalk through so that the only thing we're getting is the ears going through the combine. So real quickly, I'm going to focus a little bit about the corn head, if you will, here in a few minutes, but we're looking at that position above the feeder house, which is labeled as number one. The corn cob and the material goes through a concave and cylinder, which you see here. The beater keeps it from wrapping around the concave. In this point, a lot of the action as far as the shelling of the corn happens at this stage. The material that is heavier, lighter, goes out through the straw walkers and then goes out as distribution. The grain actually falls down, the heavier items, you'll see a fan here, I don't see a number on it, but the grain will fall down into this section called the 6 auger, which basically is taking it to a cleaning sieve and Schaefer. These items are moving back and forth. The clean grain will actually, excuse me, the clean grain will actually go through a sieve and then drop into an auger that's taken up into the grain tank. There's another item back in the back that does not pass through the screen, but is heavy enough that is not blown out the back. And so that material will be taken and transferred back into the cylinder and recycled again. And so most combines have a port that you can take a look at as far as looking at the tailings elevator, which is this one at the very end back here behind 7 below the sieves. We'll have a couple comments about that in the future. So there's several different types of combines that we're looking at. All of them have these same principles on it. I think that's one reason we call them a combine. John Deere in their most recent conversions, we're looking at axial flow type a cylinder and concaves. Again, the thinking has always been that this gives a lot more opportunity for the cobs and the corn to be able to be shelled as we're going back through there instead of this small space that you see here in previous designs. Again, a lot of the different items that you see in the newer combine are all there as far as looking at areas for walking out the straw or the residue, the leaves and etc. A section about sieving, and then basically separation of trying to separate the fines, a small material that can be blown out the back along with the leaves and etc. Probably the thing that I want to remind us about is that There's lots of adjustment all the way through this particular combine. If you remember, these items can be used from everything from rice all the way down, soybeans, everything but maybe cotton. And so a lot of the grains that we're looking at, no matter what the size is and et cetera, can be put through a combine, and there's different settings for each one of those crops. And so the operator's manual is critical. Within a corn situation, again, like I mentioned, we're trying to reduce the amount of biomass that goes through the combine, but at the same time trying to separate, make sure that we get the ears falling through. If you'll notice where this gentleman is standing, this is the corn head looking back into it, going into the feeder house. This gentleman is standing basically where the corn snout will come down onto that particular item, but it's a good way to be able to identify several different items. These little chain hooks right here are called gathering chains, and they basically are pulling the stock back into the combine. Underneath there is what they refer to as roller, corn rollers, and that's our stalk rollers, and that's pulling the stalks down through that little opening right here. That's adjustable. The chains are adjustable as far as speed going back through here. That opening is adjustable. That will become a critical in some of our conversation, because in drought type corn, the stalks will probably be smaller in diameter and maybe in a little less brittle. And so this opening becomes critical on what we might make some adjustments. But there are several different U-tubes available to go through the adjustment of the corn head. And the only reason that I'm showing the upper one is basically that a lot of times you can lose a corn ear, if you will, in this particular area by bouncing around and bouncing out of the corn head. But most of the time, when you get it to this stage, it'll actually move into the feeder house and then in through the combine. So I don't get abused about having one color. Several different combine arrangements here. Again, an axial flow combine. Again, several of the same items that we talk about in the combine area. The differences being with small grain and soybeans, we typically have a platform header that basically in that particular arrangement, you're bringing that whole anything that's cut above the sickle bar is being brought into the combine to be separated. And likewise for some of the older red machines, again, several different of the components we've already talked about. Again, if we're looking at droughty soybeans, probably the only thing I can make a comment is this is critical. The header, the platform header is critical as far as being able to bring that in. A lot of shatter loss is going to occur here in this. And then, of course, since we have droughty conditions, the beans are going to be smaller. That means that some of the things that we're talking about in the concave and sieve area will need to be adjusted. So here are some tips as far as adjustments within looking at, especially on corn. Pre-scouting is critical, and also being able to make a wise decision about whether we really need to be out there combining this particular crop. And I've got some other slides talking a little bit more about details about that. Again, there probably will be a section in the operator's manual that talks about conditions that we have as far as looking at a droughty type crop. Again, typically the ear is going to be smaller in diameter. There's going to be places, and let me bounce forward if I can. There's going to be areas on the corn that's not filled out. That means that there's kernels that aren't as solid as typically. And again, we're talking about if this is a typical irrigated or well developed corn ear, it may have probably around 3/4 of a pound. It may take 2 ears to be equivalent to that. So that'll come into play when we're talking about some of the issues as far as harvest loss. As we've already mentioned, the principles of effective combining, we would like to keep that combine loaded. What I typically experience when there's a low amount of material going through it, you hear a lot of bouncing around. That's where cobs are coming up and just deflecting off of the concave and hitting different sections. And so I really think that crop feeding may be an issue. If we can get it in the combine and get enough load into it, I think we have a lot of opportunities to shell effectively and get some good grain. During that pre-scouting, if we have a lot of lodged stalks, it might be useful to use a drone to be able to look at the directions of how the crop has fallen. That'll give the operator a good idea about how to approach it. And basically, when you're looking at launched items, you would like to have the stalks going into the combine so that the ear is closest to the combine. So let's talk a little bit about the corn head. The gap needs to be adjusted. Typically, it needs to come together so that the stalk is narrow enough so that the stalk can go through it, but at the same time snaps off that smaller ear. The gathering chain needs to be matched with the forward speed of the combine. And just as a rule of thumb, or an example, 2 miles an hour, the chain speed needs to be about 27 RPM. So that'll give you a little bit of a feel how to match that up. You'll have to increase the gathering chain if the stalk is leaning away from the combine. One of the items that I keep hearing about is if you use snouts or adaptions for being able to lift up lodged corn, you probably would want to check into a automatic head adjustment so that you're not you're actually running the header a lot closer to the ground than you typically would. And this would avoid maybe some rock pickup and et cetera that could happen. The other item on the corn head is that typically the corn head is attached to the feeder house, and it's typically angled down at an angle of about 25 to 30 degrees. And kind of talking about this, if I can use that, my old model here is that we're talking about this flex within the corn head and the height of what it's running. In a droughties type situation, it's going to be running a little bit closer to the ground, but you want to angle that such that the header is about 20 degrees. Moving into the combine, the concave area, because the ears are smaller, you're going to have to collapse or the clearance will be narrower there at the concave and cylinder area. Decrease the speed a little bit, especially for spongy type cobs. You'll need to look at the tailings and et cetera to see if you're tearing them up too bad, but you don't want a very aggressive thrashing area. And so you want to keep the material in the rotor a little bit longer, but at the same time, the reason you're slowing it down a little bit is try to decrease the excessive kernel damage that can occur. As you move back to the sieve area, because the kernels are probably going to be a little bit smaller, you'll need to reduce the sieve openings and then adjust like I was talking about with tailings. I think I've got another slide on that a little later. Again, the fan speed needs to be reduced because the kernel sizes have been reduced. Now think about everything that I've talked about here on these adjustments, and what you've done is basically you've opened yourself up to a lot of fines and other material coming into the clean grain elevator area because we're not blowing them away as aggressively. And so that needs to be thought about in the total scheme of things, is that you're probably going to end up with a grain mass that's more dirty and probably going to be harder to dry and store. When you're running through the field, suggest to run it at your fullest capacity that you can, shut down after 100 feet, and do some checking of how things are working. If the corn cobs are excessively chopped, especially crossways or cross-sectional from the ear, some adjustments need to be made because there must be some aggressive items in that concave area that's chopping that cob. Or if there's excessive grain on the ends of the cob, we may need to make some narrowing of the adjustment in the concave area. Stalks being cut off in that corn header and then drawn through the combine, we don't want that. So this is a good time to check how that's working, whether we need some adjustments on the speed roll or the snap rollers to be able to pull that through. We'll look at some harvest loss tables, and then of course look at the residue distribution behind, so that you're not creating a problem for next year. I really think that when we're looking at drought corn, that we're looking at grain quality issues. Again, I mentioned the fines, the moisture. Again, it's going to be a little bit more in a dusty type situation, so combine fires are possible. You may need to set up a special operation of doing a cleaning process and a drying. I would highly recommend, if that is an option, make sure that you're taking that corn material after it drops through and moving it away from the storage area. Again, you need to make considerations. Is this material worthy to try to store? It's going to be more difficult. And remember that when you're looking at this material, do not allow it to stay in a bin or a grain cart overnight. You've got kernels that are probably going to be a little bit less intact than usual, and so trying to move it and get it a little bit, as you take a grain mass like this out of the field, it has a lot of heat that needs to be taken out, so it needs to get into some kind of aeration process to help it remove that heat in the mass. So the question is to take it directly to storage, start drying that down, and remember that our bins are set up for two different ways. Aeration, that's just to be able to get the differences in the grain mass temperature-wise even, or there's what I call a natural air drying bins that we're trying to push, and typically you're looking at a 0.5 CFM for the aeration and over a 1 CFM for getting some kind of drying process through the bin. And of course, if people go after their droughty corn first, I think that putting it on the bottom of the bin is not a wise decision. Probably the one slide I want to show here, this is one with there's an excellent video out at University of Nebraska that shows a farmer that's been dealing with drought and lodge corn. He goes through the header process, the extra snouts, and etc. I think you can find that fairly easily on the website. But again, keeping a fire extinguisher ready to go is critical if you need it in this type of condition. Typically, when we're looking at harvest losses, we're looking at 1/100th of an acre, going across the width of the row heads. And the rule of thumb is that every 3/4 of a pound ear, which may be either 2 or 3 droughty type ears, found in that area is equivalent to 1 bushel per acre. And then on the kernel basis, if one of the issues you get into sometimes is that the in the corn head, shelling actually starts in that corn head, and so you can find kernels that are already bouncing out of that particular area before it gets in the combine and into the clean grain tank. So there's another way to look at those kernels. So 20 kernels within a 10 square foot area is equivalent to 1 bushel per acre. Please take a check on the pre-harvest area to make sure that you account for those items that there's no way the combine can catch. In other words, ears that have already dropped off are not going to be caught by the combine. And so making sure you do that. Looking at the header, so that means that basically you're running into the growing crop and then backing up. So you've got a header loss type component, and then after the combine, looking at that. These are ideal type conditions. My feeling is that in a droughty type of situation, you're realistically looking at somewhere between 5 to 15 bushel per acre potential loss. And so combine's not going to be able to capture all that. We can only do the best we can. The last two slides that I have are reminding individuals that there's some good materials out there about setting up your yield monitor. Probably the thing that to remind people about is that if we're operating in very low yielding type crops as a potential within a droughty type of situation, that the combine needs to be calibrated for the speed that you're going. And so if you're not filling up the combine sufficiently, and getting it up to the mass that you typically have, it has to be calibrated for those areas. And you have to remember that what you're gathering and the information is the mass indicator of how much mass is coming through the clean elevator into the grain tank. A very good guide with a lot of good pictures in it is from Clemson. Recommend you taking a look at that one. I think I have a few items, but they've all been archived recently with the Precision Ag. But before the yield monitor operation, and one of the reasons I think it's kind of critical to talk about it now is that GPS units, if they've not been used during the summer, take a little bit of time when you first fire them up in the fall to get all the data that's needed for uploading. And so, and matter of fact, my understanding is that there's going to be a major upload time period in September, the end of September. And so that could cause farmers to be able to pull out their units and all of a sudden go, geez, I got a 2 or 3 hour wait while all this gets downloaded and ready to go. So now's a good opportunity to pull that out, clean out the combine, make sure we don't have any existing crops in it, and doing the maintenance that's needed for the combine before heading out. Quick reminder that the Farm Safety Week is in September, 21st through the 25th. There are several different organizations that go over different items. I think the group that has the initiative on working with mental health would be a great one to probably emphasize during this time period as we move into these kind of conditions and the stresses that are already on our farm clientele. And with that, Robbie, I'm going to turn it back over to you. I've enjoyed doing it. Most of the publications that I've been involved with over the last 2 years, I've updated. And so plenty of materials. I think there's 30 different fact sheets that we've updated. We've taken the one out that was most used because we need to update it and really do some revisions in it. That's the planter and drill setup. And so Dave Holthauser and I will be working on that, trying to get that done before the next planting season. And so, you know, just so that you know, the corn crop here at Blacksburg looks pretty decent. You can see in the background from my other project is a '69 Chevrolet pickup that my granddad bought brand new and part of my inheritance going forward. So, Robbie, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grisso. We really appreciate you joining us this morning and sharing an excellent presentation. I know that's going to really help a lot of folks as we move into harvest season, at least here in the eastern part of the state where we do have some of those drought-stricken fields. Any questions for Dr. Grisso? I'm just going to go ahead and open it up. You should be able to unmute yourself at this time. So if you have any questions, go ahead and ask those, and we'll try to address them one at a time. Well, I guess you did a perfect job, Dr. Grisso. I don't hear any.
I can hardly believe that for a second. I must have overwhelmed it with a little bit too much.
I guess one question that I've got, Dr. Grisso, in some of my conversation with producers, you mentioned in your presentation about making that decision as to whether or not there may be enough of a crop there to actually justify running the combine through there. And we've certainly got some fields in this part of the state that's probably going to be not an option. It's just not enough there to really justify running the machine through. So I know quite a few people have asked the question, residue management, what options we've got there. The unfortunate side is most of the corn that I've seen that has been severely stricken by drought, had really good growth to it. It had even got up to the tassel growth stage. So we're talking, 10, 12 foot corn stalks in the field. Any advice or suggestions for that residue management if the combine isn't justified to be put into that crop?
Well, I think that, let me just say that from my experience in the West, there was always an option to try to bring in livestock and clean up some of the items. Eventually, you're going to, and it depends. It depends on the biomass that we're talking about here, and how it actually laid down. If things start to, and I'm always surprised compared to the Midwest, how quickly our residue degrades within Virginia. And so with our climate and so forth, it may not be a huge issue, but at the same time, if I do have a residue problem that I know I'm going to have an issue with planting, shredding is always an option. Being able to run any kind of animals over it to pick it up. Of course, it's going to be a conservation type item now with deer and et cetera. But you have to think about your rotation process in the mix of this, is that if you have a field that you're not going to harvest, you have a lot of volunteer corn, and so all of a sudden it should play into your rotation. If you go back to corn again, there's a good potential that you'll have a lot of competition and very little weed control that you can do.
Thanks, Dr. Grosso. Any other questions or comments this morning? I see one just popped up here from Mike. He says, due to some crops doing poorly this year, for insurance sake, are there any figures on what it costs now per acre to run a semi-new combine?
I'm just going to tell you what I've been seeing as far as custom rates. That's usually the only thing that I have. If you have your combine, it's probably going to cost you somewhere between $10 and $15 an acre. A lot of custom rates are up to $20 to $25 an acre. And so those would not be numbers that I think if we take a look, especially with some of the ag economists, that would be in line with what I've experienced anyway. Good question, Mike.
All right. Any other questions for Dr. Grosso this morning?
And while I'm waiting a little bit, I want to thank those, and I see Doug is on the line here today. Super job with the Shenandoah AREC field day yesterday. Very professional, and so I know y'all guys are having to figure out how to do this in a different way, and it looks like you're doing an excellent job doing it.
All right. Well, not hearing any further questions. Just checking the chat. I don't see any other questions there at this time. So with that being said, Dr. Grosso, we really appreciate you joining us this morning. Thank you for the presentation. We will have the recording of this posted along with all of our other presentations on VC Ag today. So for those that would like to see that afterwards, it will be posted there. We see the link on the screen where those can be found at. And we also, Dr. Grosso was kind enough to share his slides with us so we could share those with anyone, a hard copy that would request those. So thank you, Dr. Grosso. We really appreciate you joining us this morning. Excellent presentation.
Have a great day.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grosso. Just a few closing comments for those that are with us. Please join us next week. We're going to be joined by our forage specialist, Dr. Katie Payne, down from the Blackstone Research Center down there. We're going to have some discussion on pasture management coming into the fall months, talking about weed management, renovation of pasture, several topics related to that. So please join us for that. Also, just a huge thank you to our summer interns this year, Miss Skylar Swan in Westmoreland County and Miss Shelley Underwood in Hanover County. I think today is going to be the last edition of VC Ag today that they're going to be able to join us on. So just thank you both so much for all of your help with this effort. We really appreciate you being here, and you've done an excellent job. So thank you very much for that, and best wishes in your future endeavors. Also, just like to take a second to thank the production team for this, Mr. Trent Jones, Mr. Mike Broadus, Ms. Laura Maxine, and Miss Stephanie Rommelcheck. Thank you all for all of your help with this. And finally, please take a few moments to evaluate the program. You'll see a link there on your screen. If you could just take a minute or two to help us provide some feedback and make the program better, or let us know some topics that you may like to see in the future, we'd greatly appreciate that. So thank you again to everyone for joining us. Thank you again, Dr. Grisso, for all of your advice and excellent presentation. Hope everyone has a great rest of their Thursday, and take care. Thank you.